Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. I have to just put out the disclaimer that this isn't our first webinar, but it's the first time we run this webinar. So bear with us. There is a survey at the end, and we'd love to hear about anything that wasn't clear or that we didn't explain properly, things we went too quickly, too slow over, all of those sorts of things. I'll just start by saying I'm Bree, and this is Chad, and we make up NKC Social Impact Consulting. And yes, we are life partners as well as business partners, and we do manage to work together successfully, I would say. And that's a question we get often, so I just like to cover it off right at the beginning. So today we're going to obviously talk about applying to grants, and we'll get into a little bit of our background, but we are really excited to help other people understand the grant world, because everyone's been telling us about how confusing and kind of alienating it is, and we want to break that down. So that's the reason for us hosting this.
And before we get started, I just want to give a land acknowledgement that we are on Treaty 6 territory where we work, live, and play, and homeland of the Métis here in Saskatoon. And in both our professional and our personal lives, we strive toward reconciliation and to restore relationships to each other and to the land.
Yeah, just to get into who we are, between the two of us, we have over 30 years of experience doing health and social research, writing, and project management. I used to have a career in interior design, and it's sort of just morphed into slowly doing a little bit more research and working alongside Chad. And I've really enjoyed that. And I keep the interior design on the side as kind of a little hobby I'll do for friends and family and that sort of thing. And of course, myself, I've always got a project on the go at home. Over those years of experience, we've actually helped secure over $10 million in research and program development funding, as including small business grants. We're actually, when we were putting this course together, the paid course that we'll talk about and this webinar, we were totaling up how many grants we've written and how much has been funded. And I don't think we expected it to be 10 million. So anyways, we're really pumped to be able to say that. Because of course, everything we work on is towards some level of social betterment. And that really is what we're passionate about, is improving things socially in all sorts of realms. So again, this avenue is us wanting to be as supportive as we can for purpose-driven businesses, social enterprises, nonprofits, for-profits, you name it. If you help improve the world, we want to help you do that more, and with funding. And I guess, did you want to say anything about your background?
Oh yes, sorry, I did skip myself. Yeah, so I have a background in psychology. I did more years of study than I want to admit, but through that I have jumped through different sectors. I've worked in research and in the nonprofit sector, and now in business, and through that learned a lot about the different ways that people secure funding to continue their various activities. So it's been a steep learning curve, but one that I'm enjoying and want to continue. So what are our training objectives for today?
Okay, so our training objectives. So we really want to help you move toward grant preparedness. I have to admit that we aren't going to accomplish that in this call, in this 1 hour. This is a big skill to develop. It's a muscle that you probably haven't used a whole lot unless you have written grants, or that maybe you didn't even know you had. So, but we want to talk to you about some of the very initial steps that you might take in order to move toward grant preparedness. And we also want to talk about the ways that we can support you to move even closer to that following the call. I wish I could get you there in 1 hour, but it's a big world. We also want to ease the process of applying so that it's less daunting and it takes less time and effort. When we talk to people, that's the number one thing that comes up is, oh, it takes so much time. I'm already so busy. I don't even know where to find grant opportunities. And I'm worried I'm going to put the time and the effort into writing a grant proposal, and I won't get the money. So that's a really big thing. And it's something that we feel very confident that we can address and help people, because of course, yes, when you're busy and you're struggling already and you've got this capacity, you know, we're all overstretched, right? Or at least I'm making that assumption. Those grant funds can make all the difference in setting up new systems, in helping you hire people to help you, in up-leveling your digital tools. So that's what we want to help you by improving accessibility to grant funding. And again, working toward that social betterment. We love to be able to say that we helped in some way support this program or initiative or business that helps people in some way.
So we're going to start very bare bones here for a moment. Take a pause and just take a step back. We realize that people come into this webinar with potentially varying backgrounds and experience in grant writing. So we want to just take pause and ask the question, what do you think a grant is? I've listed here some possible characteristics. And if you want to just pump into the chat your responses here to the questions I have here. So I'm asking, do you think a grant is unrestricted funding, which is, it can be used for anything? Do you think of it as an investment, that somebody is putting money into you acquiring capital or equipment or that sort of thing? And do you think that it is to support your operations, whatever organization or project you have going on? Do you think of a grant as helping you with your day-to-day operations? In fact, a grant is none of these things. So there are different forms of funding.
So that's such a Chad thing, is to put a trick question in.
Yes, yes, indeed. There are many types of funding out there, including capital investments, bank loans, those sorts of things. But when we talk about grants, grant funding, we're talking about something a bit specific. And some of those characteristics, although it does depend on the type of grant. Some of them allow you to buy things, acquire equipment, and that sort of thing. There's some very specific characteristics to grants that make it stand out from other kinds of funding you might secure. So for one, a grant is usually a very specific investment in a project. So you have to state clearly in an application a predefined activity that you're requesting money for. That money can't be used for anything else or translated and put into something more general or used to support your day-to-day operations. It is very specific to that activity predefined. It's also restricted. So each grant call that you will encounter will have some sort of statement about what includes or what is an eligible expense and what is an eligible activity. So they will state very clearly, here's what you can apply for and here's what you cannot. So it is restricted in that way. You can't take it beyond what is considered eligible expenses. On the plus side, what a grant stands out from in other forms of funding, like a loan or investment, is that there's no payback fees. You do not have to pay this money back, unless, of course, you violate the contract of the funding or that sort of thing. There are circumstances when that happens, but assuming you follow through on the plan that you've stated in your application, you do not owe anything back to your funder. So that is a key characteristic, and that's helpful for a lot of us who are just getting started and don't have the extra money to pay back a loan or that sort of thing.
And I will note that I don't know if we've ever, I mean, if you don't use funds, typically you have to send them back, but that would be more in like a research and university setting. And I do see that we have a couple university students joining us. So there are circumstances where you do have to send funding back, but it's very uncommon. So we will talk about the types of grants. There's a couple different types, and it's good to know the types that are out there because for us, understanding the academic side of things, I see a lot of opportunities to bridge university and research and for-profit businesses or nonprofit, right? Because if you have a program that you're going to start and you're going to run, a lot of the information that you need is very similar. And if you can collaborate with somebody in the university or research world, and I know that that's something that's a bit inaccessible at this point, but that's something that we love to do, is create collaborations and partnerships. Then if you can build that research component into your program, typically we find that the amounts you can get for research are tenfold what you can get for just program funding. So that is what gets us to that 10 million overall total is not $2,500 at a time or even 50,000 at a time. The research grants are often several hundred thousands of dollars at once, right? So that is something to consider if you really want to get into this and scale upward. So there are business development grants, and again, that's could be something like the CDAP, Canadian Digital Adoption Program, and I don't expect you to remember that off the top of your head, but that is one that gives you $2,400 to up-level your technology. There's also some that will do like a $50,000 amount or 30, right? So we're looking at that kind of amount, and typically those will fund you creating a new activity or initiative. They're probably not going to end up funding something that already is happening within your business in the way that it's already happening. So if you've got to be implementing some sort of change or growth, development is the word there. There's program support. So that would be a little bit more geared toward nonprofit, although not completely outside of the realm of research and business. But Program support would be something that has a really strong social betterment aspect to it. So if you're going to run a program, say, for example, to support women, and it's going to be free to them, and it's going to increase their financial literacy and ability to get employment, something like that is considered a support program. So you might be able to get funding for something like that. And the grant that comes to my mind would be the Community Initiatives Fund. It's 30,000 or 50,000, depending on the region that you're working within. And then there's research and evaluation. So those are often much larger ticket grants. We've worked on grants that are anywhere from 250,000 to what is it, like 3 million, and so those are some pretty big numbers. And to be honest, we've not only gotten those grants, and the reason I tell you this is because we've been able to stick around and see how those function. And in my opinion, those research grants, they're 10 times more the amount of a business development grant, but because they have the research aspect to it, they're just that much more money, because they're often coming from different funding agency, and they want that data and that information. So if you can build that into a partnership and a collaboration, you don't have to learn how to do research or evaluation, but you can partner with somebody who does those things. And they wouldn't be taking, an academic doesn't take a salary, right? So something to consider once you feel like you've got a handle on the grant world. So when we're fishing for grants, a big question we get is, where do we find them? And, I'm not sure people actually get to the point, and you can let me know in the chat, do you actually get to the point where you're looking at grant opportunities, or have you been able to find grant opportunities? One hurdle I find many people experience is deciding what's relevant and what they're eligible for. Because if those two things don't line up, then there's no point in you applying to the grant.
So there are many different sources for seeking out grants, and I've kind of clustered these into 4 different ones. I'll explain them very briefly. So the biggest fish in the pond by far is our federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments. They are the biggest source, and I would say the federal, out of all of those, is the largest source of funding, regardless of sector. Especially federal government, they cover every sector of society, whether you're for-profit, nonprofit, does not matter. They have grants for different activities. So they are the biggest fish in the pond when it comes to finding grants and securing them. Another competitor to that, though, would be community foundations. So these are based from organizations. It could be a corporate entity that has created a foundation to support some sort of community development work. There are lots out there, like, for example, Co-op has these types of community initiative funds. Some of our larger retailers like Walmart and Canadian Tire do these as well, but there are all sorts of foundations that are out there. Some of them are specific to different causes, like, for example, Movember for prostate cancer and men's health. They're all over the place, but it's important to realize that that is a kind of cluster of sources of funding. And then there's trusts, community trusts as well. Again, similar idea to the foundation. This is a dedicated body that's got some sort of money, maybe it is from somebody's estate, to fund particular activities. And again, application process to get access to those. I included search engines as well, because sometimes you can, although I would not highly recommend it, just Google to find your potential grant sources, because that's a bit of a rabbit hole. You will get lots of stuff, particularly when we're thinking about finding relevant and eligible grants for you. Search engines can throw you off quite a bit. They can take you down paths that are not relevant for you, or seem relevant, but when you look a little more closely, they are not. However, there are screening tools out there, and we'll share a few links in a couple slides here, that are created by well-regarded organizations to help you find grants that are relevant and that you are eligible for. So that can be a helpful source as well.
And in terms of eligibility too, I just want to mention that, a lot of times you need to be a registered, well, for sure, you need to be a registered business. And some of them will have things like you need to have $30,000 of income reported on your last tax year. There are exceptions to that, but the majority of opportunities are available to businesses that are actually incorporated, not just registered, but incorporated and have a certain level of income. Although there are some that are available for startups and businesses that haven't reported that level of income. The first one and the last link, the federal government and the FundsNet, I believe are free to access. And the middle one from Pocketed is a tool for grants for businesses, and that is a paid service. We are not affiliated with them necessarily, but I do currently have a membership with them. So that's something that we do use with and for our clients to make like a funding strategy. And it just depends on what it'll look different for every single person. Pocketed does do quite a few webinars and information sharing. And I've found that if you go to a webinar, there you'll often get a code for a free year of their basic service, which is really great if you're just starting into the grant world. So then we can talk about qualifying for a grant. So before you're worried about submitting an application and whether you'll get the money or not, you have to figure out, is this grant a good fit? Do I align with the grant, and does it align with me? So there's a couple different aspects that we would look at, and we will go as far as like creating a table so that we can compare different opportunities so that you can decide, which one would you apply to first and sort of create a hierarchy. We also would look at obviously the deadline, because grant deadlines are non-negotiable, even by 1 minute. We've had that happen before. And I can say there was a time when I was submitting a very large grant application to the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation Research Center, and the power in the entire University of Ottawa, we were living in Ottawa at the time, went out 20 minutes before the deadline, and I didn't have this grant submitted, and I was the last in line. I was putting a few things in, and this was when I was a research assistant, so it was quite a while ago, and I was working under a professor there, and I couldn't submit the grant on time. Luckily, the university vouched for us and said, "Yep, we did lose power for this period of time," and it allowed them to. They allowed us to submit the grant, but that is a very rare occasion, and I had to have a massive institution vouch for me for why I couldn't submit it on time. So best case scenario is submit it the day before. So in terms of relevance, when you're looking at a grant call, they will very clearly list what their priorities are, because a funding agency is very similar to you in a sense, right? Like they've gotten money from somewhere, probably some sort of federal government program of some sort, or there's going to be, they have to report on where their money went and what impact it made, right? So that's what they're looking at. So if you look at the grant call very closely and pay attention to the words that they're using, you'll be able to tell as you get some practice if this is something that really fits for you. Oftentimes they'll say you have to fit within one of these 5 categories, and it might be education or gender equity or helping equity seeking groups and that sort of thing, right? There's a lot of different things, teaching about health and wellness, right? There's all kinds of things like that. And so what you can do is actually figure out by reading those words if that fits within your project. And so it's important to remember that grants are for anyone. There's very few professions that don't really apply for that couldn't get a grant, because what they're funding is the activity, not the business or the job or the position. So that's important to remember. So relevance, it's got to align with your goals and those of the funders. So you have to ask yourself if you're willing to sort of meet them in the middle. The eligibility, very closely take a look at those, because that will be a make or break, right? If it's not there, it's not there, and you can move on to the next opportunity. Makes it really quick to decide if it's something you should be doing. Readiness, and that's a big thing that we address in the grant writing course that we run, is how to get pieces put together sort of ahead of time. So you're not just creating this whole vision from scratch. Having some things prepared ahead of time, which is what we work on in our course, is huge, right? You will also come out with clarity about your business, because you have to very clearly define, what do I want to achieve? Why do I want to achieve it? Why do I know that there's a gap here and that there's a need for this thing that I want to create? Or why do I want to research this thing if you're a university student? So those are important things. You will also, in a grant application, very much have to show that you have the capacity to manage the funds and the project activities. So you want to really think about how you would do that. Like, let's say they gave you the money, and within a month you kind of have to be moving forward, right? You can't wait for 6 months, because oftentimes there's a specific amount of time that you have to do the project. So they'll ask you, how are you going to implement this? And I think it's entirely possible. And it's an excellent exercise in planning and doing that project management and planning, which is something that we all have to do. I don't know of any profession where you don't have to do some sort of project planning. And you have to be registered. So as I mentioned before, you do have to be a registered business. There will be certain requirements such as citizenship, enrollment as far as like students, student grants, and things like that. Sometimes there's age requirements if it's a hiring grant for training youth or getting youth experience and stuff like that. And then the other thing, like I said, is being incorporated is sometimes part of the eligibility. So that's something to just know right off the bat. Oh, I'm not quite there yet, but keep it in your pocket for next year or the, a couple of years down the road if you plan to incorporate.
Okay, so we're going to just go through a few high-level tips here on how to write grants, things to keep in mind as you plan for these. One of the most critical things I would say when it comes to planning is to create what's called a work-back schedule. So this is essentially planning the milestones, the steps toward the application submission itself backwards. So you start with the submission deadline. When does this all need to come in? And then from there, you look backwards. So in terms of the work back schedule, I've created just a little template here that you can see with a bit of the information here. So this is really, once you have pinpointed a grant opportunity you want to apply to, you can take something like a work back schedule and populate, okay, here's what I need. Here are the different pieces I need to put together for this application. And here is anticipating the amount of time that it's going to take to prepare it. Here's the deadline for me. It's a way of making yourself accountable, but it also helps break down the process because grants can be really daunting. Some of them have so many different pieces to it. It takes an entire team to manage. And so breaking it down into each step makes it more manageable for yourself, especially around time management. Because depending on your grant, it can take a couple of days to write. It can take several months to write, depending on how big and complicated it is. So a work back schedule is a good way to just prepare in advance what each of your milestones are and when you need to get there.
And we don't hope to scare you away from it by saying that you've got to create a schedule like this and it takes months to write. That is the reality, especially for those research grants. They are quite a bit more rigorous. We can do a grant for small business in like 20 hours, maybe 15, depending on what they're looking for, or we can do a research grant in more like 80 hours. So, and that's, like, again, two people that are doing it quite often. Chad and I pass things back and forth, so we're always reviewing. So the thing that I want to say is that regardless of the size of the grant, I think it's important for you to have some sort of support, whether that's somebody on your team that you are already working with or a consultant or something like that, especially for your first few. I think it's important to have a group that you can go to or a couple of people that you can go to, toss ideas around, and make sure that what you're writing is clear and makes sense, and that you're not overwhelmed if you're able to get somebody else to pull some of the details together for you. So we've got we just wanted to kind of let you know how we approach grant writing. I would say the one that's not in here would be Notion, and we're just starting to use that. So it's a project management tool. The other one is Asana. So we recommend just making sure that you're using some tools that are going to make this easier for you. We'll use shared folders oftentimes with our clients and collaborators so that everybody has access to the newest version of the grant document. I have a Word document and everything is in there. We've got notes, we've got everything written, every question we need to answer, checklists, all that kind of thing. And that's something I'll set up right at the beginning of the call or of the project when we start writing the grant. So we use Asana, which is like the 3 dots at the end for project management right now. We're looking at potentially doing a template for grant writing on Notion that would kind of help you set up, that would give you a framework for actually writing a grant, no matter what size the grant is. We often use Excel, we use PowerPoint, and we use Canva because sometimes you need to make some sort of a visual. It could even be a visual timeline. I use a visual timeline on almost every single grant application that I've ever written, and I've lost count. And so Canva is one of the ways, or Excel could be used as well to make a visual representation of, okay, this is the, say, 12 months of my project, and this is when everything's going to happen throughout that timeline.
It's also important to acknowledge that you don't have to do this all on your own when it comes to a grant. There's many ways that you can find support, whether informal or formal. So one of the most helpful, easy, and affordable ways to find support is to ask questions, especially of the funders. Most of the time, they will have contact information for you to inquire. If something is unclear to you, say, for example, whether you're eligible or not, or some part of the application isn't clear to you what you're supposed to put in there, you can certainly reach out to them. It will not impact the review process of your application. The people who are on the other end of that contact info are not going to be your reviewers. They're normally people who are part of the organization who are just managing or overseeing the program. So ask questions, ask as many as you can, get information. If it's permitted, schedule a call beforehand to inquire and have a conversation with them. This also goes for after you apply. So say you submitted a grant and you were rejected for it, but they didn't give you really any feedback on why you weren't awarded the grant. Ask for an interview, a post-interview with them, where you can ask, okay, what were you looking for? What are some things I can improve for next time? Those types of questions are really critical because it's not just a one-shot thing, or a one shot, I should say, when it comes to grants. Treat each grant that you apply to as a building block for another grant. So if you don't succeed that first time, don't just say, okay, well, I'm going to delete that file. I'm going to start fresh with the next one. Use that as an opportunity to strengthen your future applications. You can also hire somebody to assist with writing your grant application. That is the bread and butter of what we do, but there are many people out there who assist in some way, whether it's an editor to review something you've written to help with grammar and sentence structure and those sorts of things. Not everyone feels comfortable in their writing, and so having an extra set of eyes to review is certainly helpful in that way. Or having professional grant writers, people who do this for a living, such as ourselves, who know the ins and outs of the various aspects.
And I'll point out, if your grant writer has a turtleneck, that is the utmost sign of their adequacy. So
their esteem, prestige.
Yes, the higher the turtleneck, the better the writer.
Yes.
Neither of us are wearing turtlenecks, unfortunately.
Another way to find support, and this can be really informal, is seek people to review your application. So you've put something together. I've actually, for other sorts of writing, have just shoulder tapped a friend or a family member to review it, because sometimes they pick up on things that, just because you're so close to it, some gaps that you aren't seeing, you're missing, and they pick up on it because this is fresh and new to them. Doing those sorts of things can dramatically improve the strength of your application, and they require very little on your part.
And I think it's worth mentioning that my mom has actually read, just wait for that one.
Yeah.
My mom has actually read, what was it, a philosophy paper or a
Yes.
couple that Chad had written. And so like, if you think about what papers and proposals look like, a philosophy paper would be one of the hardest to read. And he was able to ask her to read it, and she did that very willingly, which I thought was very sweet.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Ashley. Can I or should I still apply for a grant even if my project or program does not meet all of the criteria? That's a really good question.
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends on the context of the grant, but I would say more times than not, probably 90% of the time, it would not be worth your time to apply to. There's a couple of reasons for that. Depending on the review situation. So say, for example, it's a granting call where they're expecting to get 100 applications and they can only fund 3 or 4. They're going to look, the reviewers on the other side are going to look for every reason to rule out your application. And if they have stated requirements or criteria that you have to meet in order to get funding, or are strongly encouraged to meet, that's an opportunity for them to reject you right out. And that's not worth your time. That's not worth their time. You're better off finding a place that each of the criterion you hit strongly. It might, in certain circumstances, if they don't get the number of applicants they were hoping for, they might lax on some of those rules. But my instinct would say, don't put yourself out there for grants that you might get rejected just simply off their desk because you don't meet those criteria.
And as much as that was a straightforward answer as you'll ever get from Chad, I would like to muddy that clarity and say that I think there's a lot of people, and I've come across this as we've been working with various clients and academics and students and that sort of thing, that sometimes you think that you don't meet, like if you don't meet the eligibility criteria and it's very straightforward, that's one thing, don't apply to it. But if they say our priority areas are creating jobs and increasing skills, like teaching skills of some sort, you might think, oh yeah, that doesn't fit within my project. But I typically, one of my favorite things to do is that design and creation part where you're like, oh, how can we check this box that we need to check that would strengthen our application? So that's where my mind goes to something like the discussion groups that we're hoping to launch fairly soon, where you could go and think creatively with some people and workshop, how can I meet this? It's more of a soft criteria rather than the eligibility, if that makes sense. So there's sort of two different lists and one of them is definite, that's the eligibility, and the other one is more of the priorities, and that's usually where there's a lot of flexibility and creativity that you can work in there. So just depends on how hard of a limit you find you're hitting.
Yeah.
Read that question.
Yeah, so Kelly asks, I'm curious if there's any way to determine specific keywords that may bring your grant to the top of the potential applicants list.
Great question, Kelly.
Excellent question. And this is something that we, in the course of our careers of writing grants, have come to really appreciate. That's the critical importance of language. So there you may, depending on if you're applying to a research grant, a grant for business, a grant for nonprofit programs, they might have similar or parallel expectations or requirements for the grant, but they're going to have very specific language. And that often relates to the priorities that that granting call has. So that is something I think a lot of people, but okay, a lot of people maybe overlook. It's that you really need to show that you understand the topic that's or the priority that they have in their granting call, and a big part of that is the language that they use. They'll have their own lexicon, their own terminology, and the meanings of those words. And if you don't really follow those or show a strong understanding of those, that could raise questions amongst reviewers that you're a good fit for the funding. So language is actually really important.
And so one of the main ways that I pull out those key terms, and you're absolutely right, like that's absolutely a technique that I will use. It's almost like you're writing, the person that you're writing to when you're doing your proposal, think of it as though they have a really big ego. Like they want to see as much of themselves in your grant application as possible. So I would go to their social media channels. I would go to their website. If they've got any webinars or things like that going on. Typically these organizations will offer a grant, but it's in combination with a whole bunch of other activities that they're doing as well. So they're going to have a bunch of communications that are happening that are sort of linked together and enmeshed. So I would just sort of get kind of obsessed with them and go, okay, like what are they posting online? What do their blogs look like if they have them? Their facts can give you a lot of information. Their FAQs, if you go and look at those, there will be a lot of language that you see repeated. And of course, the grant call is a huge one as well, because that's going to give you some very specific words. And I just repeat, repeat, repeat. They don't want to see that you can use other words. Use their words verbatim whenever you can. So hopefully that answers your question, Kelly. It actually is really easy because they're giving you the option. Oh, the grant call. A grant call is basically when they say, okay, we've got this grant, it's an opportunity, right? We've got this call for grant applications. This is what we're looking for. And typically it'll be very, very well outlined in terms of what they're looking for. And a good example would be the Community Initiatives Fund, which I might be able to send out to everybody because they have a really great guiding document in terms of how to apply for their grants, and they have a sample. So the first part of the document talks about exactly what their priorities are. And then the second part of the document is an actual sample of an application that tells you exactly what you're going to have to answer, which is really, really powerful information. So it's just it's kind of like an RFP if you're kind of familiar with a request for proposals. It's just it's a grant call, just a different terminology. Certainly you can reach out to us on Instagram is probably a really great one, but we've also just got our new website it's up, but it's not quite finished. That's a good way to reach out if you have questions afterwards. But we did want to let you know that we are, and I'll have to put the disclaimer out that we're creating a lot of these things right now because it's just in the last maybe 6 months has become very apparent to us that we can be providing some support here. So we have some things that are available and some things that are upcoming. So in our newsletter, which we actually have not sent a newsletter yet, but we would love for you to be one of the first people to receive it. We're going to talk about upcoming grant opportunities. So when we look at, say, Pocketed, we can go, oh, this might be great. And we can share that information with you without you having to do a webinar through Pocketed and get the free code and or pay for their service. So that's something we're going to do. And we're going to make one-page grant summaries so that you can look quickly at this one-page grant summary and decide if it aligns with you or if it may be something you want to look into a little closer. So we want to basically provide an easier way for you to find potential opportunities, even if you're just watching them for now. And the other thing is there are training subsidies. So if you wanted to, say, take our grant course or have one of your team take your grant course, or a whole plethora of other training, there's a whole bunch of opportunities for training subsidies where you can actually get up to $10,000 a year to take training. And when we formulated our course on grant writing, we made sure that we were eligible. We met the criteria so that if you wanted to apply for that funding, it would completely cover the entire course. So that's something that we're really excited about, and we're just trying to navigate how to kind of get that off the ground and help people access that so that you can do our training for free.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've mentioned a couple of here that are specific to Saskatchewan. I did see at least one person is not based in Canada, and others might be from other places in the country. I think these types of grants are pretty common, particularly in the post-COVID era where people's jobs have been all shooken up. These are ways of getting employment and the labor sector back on track. And so I'm sure there are ones in the US that are similar to this, and there are ones pretty much in every province and territory that are kind of a federal provincial partnership to fund employee training. So just take a look based on where you live, what opportunities out there, and let us know if you need to find out about the eligibility there.
And as we mentioned, we just wanted to talk about the few ways that we can support you. These are our paid ways, so the newsletter would be a way for you for free to just continue to watch what's going on and maybe get more familiar with some of the things that are coming out in the grant world. And I think watching and reading some different things that we're putting out in those grant summaries are a great way of kind of just getting your head into it. What we can offer you as far as services for you, just so that you're aware, is our grant writing course. We're launching our next cohort on April 3rd, I believe. We also are hoping to launch very soon, and this kind of will follow or go in conjunction with the grant writing course, although it's not a requirement, is to have a grant discussion group. So that would be something where twice a month we have sort of office hours you can pop on, and we'll have a group discussion with the other attendees about just grants in general, questions that you have about specific grants, because of course we can give you this information, but I think it's when you're actually doing it that you're going to need a little bit of guidance and that sort of thing. Yeah, Lisa says group discussion sounds great. I agree. Like, I'm excited about that. I'm going to learn, and it'll help me understand too what people are struggling with, because that's been the biggest thing, is pivoting from word of mouth business, and in the last 6 months going to actually trying to figure out how can we actually help this group a little bit more than we have been. And then the last thing is grant writing service. So if you've gotten to the end of this webinar and you're like, I don't want to do this. This isn't a muscle I want to flex. For me, I'm like that with math, right? I can do a budget. It's all good. But in terms of like stats or anything like that, I'm like, we used to be told when we were in school that we should work on the things that aren't our strengths. And I no longer believe that. Grant writing is our strength. We love it. Most people look at us in horror when we say that. and we do love it. And if it's not something that you want to do, we do write your grant for you start to finish. Yes, you're gonna have to answer some questions and make some decisions and that sort of thing, but that is a very hands-off approach to getting grants. But it does require a bit more of investment, and we'd have to be a little bit strategic to make sure that we're balancing the cost of our services against the amount of money that you stand to secure through the funding. So we've got 1 minute left here. I think we're going to end almost right on time.
Indeed, yes. Here's just a little bit of information about our course. As Bree said, it launches on April 3rd. It's a 6-week course, so we have weekly sessions, synchronous, so we're live talking with our registrants to problem solve different aspects of grant writing. Within that, we include a lot of templates, tools, and resources to help you along your way, and we've structured the course to be scaffolded. So each week builds on the previous week toward the ultimate goal of you, essentially, at the end of that 6 weeks, having the skeleton of a grant application ready to go. And we help you identify a grant that you want to apply to, and then you work your way toward that. So at the end of the 6 weeks, you don't just have the savvy around how to write a grant, you actually have a grant application in hand that you can submit. And hopefully that will carry you forward in future grant applications as well.
The first one is always the hardest, for sure.
Absolutely.
And I'll just address, Mary, thanks for mentioning templates would be great. Absolutely. We've got tools and templates, resources, and we're always building a repository of that. At this point, those are being made available to the people who are doing our demystifying grant writing course. And also will probably be involved on some level with the discussion group. So do just maybe visit our link tree and sign up for our newsletter if that's something you want to be made aware of. At this point, I don't have the specific details, but I'm definitely thinking about how to get those things out to you. And we're 1 minute past, we apologize, but thank you so much for attending. Please check out our link tree and reach out in any way that you feel comfortable if you have any more questions or anything like that.